All right, welcome to the Periphery. We're going to start doing these episodes more regularly. What we're going to do now with the show is I'm going to keep bringing on guests, outside guests, academics, journalists, people with interesting backgrounds. But so that we can put this out more and so we can cover more things. I'm also going to be we're going to be putting out this show at a more regular basis, hopefully maybe every other week, doing more just sort of chats on current events in the news. And my co-host in that is going to be Bailey Fairbanks, who is one of our fellows here at Pulaski. She's also an assistant professor of political science at the University of Central Arkansas. So she's just up the road from me. And her specialization is really in public law and American politics. So she teaches courses on constitutional law and civil liberties. And she went to Georgia State. So she's got another one of those backgrounds that fits with us here in terms of roots across different um, heartland places here. And so it's going to be a good time, I think. We're going to have fun. Although today maybe less fun. We're going to be talking about. I'm going to toss it to Bailey here in a minute. She's just going to run it through. But we're going to be
Mhm.
talking about this case that just came through from the Alabama Supreme Court, which essentially held that uh, embryos are to be treated the same as unborn children when it comes to wrongful deaths. And Bailey's going to crack open the details of this and kind of the implications of it for us. And then we're going to kind of try to get into both the legal aspects of it and the broader politics, because here we're very concerned about this creep here at Pulaski of uh, you know um, restrictions on rights or anti-democratic things that are happening not just at the national level, but out in particular places, right, in the U.S., obviously at the state level. And it's something that the post-Dobbs landscape has really opened up on the reproductive rights front in terms of the capacity of individual states to really roll back rights. And obviously, with this one, it gets particularly sticky because it's not just a question that has to do more straightforwardly, right, with like abortion, but also with uh, people who are actively trying to get pregnant and to have kids. So, Bailey, can you break down this Alabama case for us? Give us the kind of top line of it, and then maybe set up some of the reasons why it has the potential to be such a big deal.
Absolutely. Thanks, Alan, and thanks for the introduction. So this case is it's one of those cases that I don't think anybody really suspected. I think at least on the face value of what it was, is that this is how this was going to turn out. For those that aren't aware, this case started as a result of a break-in, right, that happened at a fertility clinic in Alabama. An individual broke in, destroyed several sets of embryos. Actually, there were three couples that were involved in the case. And of course, right, they then proceeded to bring the suit against the fertility clinic, but in particular against the individual, right, for wrongful death, and wrongful death of and destruction of the embryos within these circumstances. And so, right, this case has evolved well beyond that. Clearly, something that I feel like we're going to see, as you stated, right after Dobbs, with this devolution of rights. But this isn't really the first case where we've seen this idea of fetal personhood, or embryonic personhood, right, coming into play, in the legal sense. I mean, even going back to Roe, initially in Roe's in the argument, right, from Texas, the attorneys then were arguing, right, that embryos and fetuses deserved personhood and protection under the 14th Amendment. So this isn't a super shocking development. As far as everything goes, right, what this case in and of itself is doing, is basically saying that we are granting personhood and all rights of personhood, to embryos, in which, something that we've never seen before this, or at least in this blatant of an attempt. Other states have attempted this. You mentioned that I'm originally from Georgia State. I do study state courts in and of themselves, but also study, right, diversity, gender, and all of these various pieces and parts of that. And so, fetal personhood laws or concerns about fetal personhood laws predate even Dobbs. And so have been tracking those in my own research and in my own work in particular. So Georgia actually had a law. It was brought up during COVID or right prior to COVID, where they actually granted tax status to individuals who had had fetuses, right, miscarriages, all these things. They were going to be able to claim them on their taxes, right, up to a certain value. That case actually was eventually struck down, or that law was struck down in a case. But this is, again, like I said, not one of the first times we've seen it. It was, right, actually relatively successful. So you asked about implications as far as all of this goes, and if at any point you want to stop me and interrupt, you're happy to, because I can talk about this all day.
No, I want to get to that at least so we can lay
Yeah,
out the landscape
yeah,
of
you're
we
good.
can we can talk about.
So right, when we're talking about these fetal personhood laws, and in particular, right, this case in and of itself, what it's doing for IVF, so in vitro fertilization, and the process of in vitro fertilization, right? In vitro fertilization is a common practice, right, for couples that struggle with fertility. I believe statistics show that was about 92,000 IVF-based pregnancies in the United States last year, right? It's roughly 2% of the amount of pregnancies across the US every year. But this essentially is going to put a halt, at least right now, especially in Alabama. That has been the direct result of this case. IVF, or as a procedure, right, oftentimes requires the implantation, or not the implantation, but the removal of multiple eggs, right, that are then fertilized outside, and then, right, implanted. IVF has a lot of clearly medical things that are beyond my means, but the understanding is that, right, we tend to do an egg retrieval with multiple eggs, and those multiple eggs are then inseminated. And then, of course, right, the egg that is considered the most viable, or at that point, right, the embryo that is the considered most viable is then implanted. But those other embryos that were created or were fertilized are often put into cryogenic storage. Now, right, this new law, of course, is putting this into place and saying that, hey, these are now children that carry the full weight of protections of the law under the Constitution. And so immediately, right, medical hospitals in Alabama have stopped this. UAB, of course, being the largest of those, right, has stopped IVF treatments. They are still, as my understanding is, doing egg retrievals, but they are not doing any sort of implantation, right, or development of those things. Some of the implications of this, right, IVF is already an extremely expensive procedure, right, for couples to be able to undergo, right, anywhere between $10,000 and $25,000 in some cases, right, having to pay for storage, having to pay for the actual treatment. Many individual couples have to go through multiple treatments to be able to do this. And so, right, it's an expensive endeavor. Some individuals are stating, right, and some of the medical community is stating that, right, this basically removes the ability for eggs to be able to be cryogenically stored in Alabama, which of course is going to, right, add an additional expense beyond all of this. It also, of course, like I said, dealing with those embryos, oftentimes if an IVF treatment is successful, right, those embryos can either be donated for research, they can be donated to other couples, or in this case, of course, are destroyed. These medical facilities are stopping these treatments and stopping, right, the storage in particular, because they're afraid of the criminal and civil liability, right, that comes with these cases under this new wrongful death, or this potential pathway for wrongful death persecution.
I mean, one of the things that just strikes me is as just immediately weird about this case is that by classifying these frozen embryos in this way, they're actually going to make it harder for some people, not a lot of people. Like you said, IVF is both expensive and time consuming, so it doesn't represent a huge amount of the actual pregnancies that occur every year in the US. But ultimately, they're going to make it harder for people who want to have kids to have kids. I mean,
Yes.
that's one of the things that's going to happen as a result of this.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
And I to me, this is an interesting area when we talk about. I think it actually gets it. Like when we talk about reproductive rights, it actually is helpful. Actually, this case, like, is a reminder that we actually mean like a full kind of gamut of things, right? Abortion is an aspect of reproductive care, but so is IVF treatment, and
Mhm.
so we talk about curtailing or restricting reproductive rights. Access to abortion care is one element of that, right? But making it harder for people who want to get pregnant through in vitro fertilization is also a restriction of people's reproductive
Mhm.
rights.
Yes.
Um, and I think there's just no getting around. I think how extreme this is, right? Like it feels really extreme.
Hmm.
The Alabama, Chief Justice of the Alabama Supreme Court, in issuing this his concurring opinion with the ruling, actually, he talks about the sanctity of the unborn, but he also then goes and quotes this passage from Jeremiah, right, which says, "Even before birth, all human beings bear the image of God, and their lives cannot be destroyed without a facing of glory." And then he cites this sort of even before you were born, I knew you, right, when you were in the womb. And it's I mean, to me, that is disturbing, right? That we have in an actual official judicial document now, right? Like very clearly citing, biblical logic for classifying frozen embryos as persons,
Hmm.
which is not, I mean, there's no element, right, of the United States or even of Alabama constitutional law, right? As much as some Alabamans might like to think, right? Even Alabama constitutional law does not actually build off of any kind of biblical conception of personhood.
Yeah, I mean, this is wild, right? You do expect to some extent, right? Because it is such a controversial area and it's such a controversial issue, you would expect some sort of dissensus. There really wasn't what much of one, right? 8 judges on that court overturned this. There was one dissent in this case, right, as a whole, but understanding and going forward with right this the wrongful death of a minor, right? That's the act that they're persecuting this under. The opinion, right, clearly states that it applies to all unborn children, right, regardless of their location. It applies to all children born and unborn without limitation. It's not the role of this court to craft a new limitation based on our own view of what is or what is not wise public policy. This is especially true where here, as the people of the state have adopted this constitutional amendment directly aiming at stopping courts from excluding unborn life from the legal protection. So, right, you were talking about the judge having the direct quote from right Jeremiah. I have a hard time really believing that, based on that case and then based on these citations and, inclusion in the law, that this isn't a personal policy preference. I mean, this court is stacked with, very conservative Republicans. Not that's shocking in the grand scheme, but there's a lot of implications, right? Beyond even just dealing with IVF, right? Like you said, abortion access and care is one aspect of this. We have seen states that have been trying with these wrongful death or right negligence cases regarding their care during pregnancy. So we're seeing right individuals that are being, you know, uh, these the actions being criminalized. Right. In some cases, right, it's women that have a history of drug abuse that may have, taken drugs, ingested drugs prior to knowing that they were pregnant. Right. Of course, in some cases, it is a sustained drug use, but we're now having states that are prosecuting these women, right, under wrongful death and the treatment of an embryo. So, there's so many facets, right, to understanding this.
Well, we're
Um,
we're approaching we're approaching an actual kind of like jurisprudence in some of these particularly southern states, right? That is like akin to the argument ad absurdum in Legally Blonde, right, where she says that essentially ejaculations are negligent, right?
yes, yes,
And
it
and
is. I
and
mean, that
that's
is
a
what's being
joke. That's
said.
a quarter century old joke at this point, right? And now we're actually in a territory where we're basically saying that. We're basically saying that, you know, any
Yeah.
fertilized egg immediately has right personhood and this is the logic, right, of like the we were, I think the Supreme Court tried to act like that the sort of pushing it back to the states in the wake of Dobbs would
Mhm.
just lead to like very sensible sort of tailor bespoke policy would be made. And people who were less comfortable with really open, and liberal abortion laws, they wouldn't have those, and then the states that wanted them would, right? But the reality is that there are places where the preference is not for, say, a more moderate, right?
Mhm.
With a shorter time frame on viability and fewer exceptions uh post first trimester. The preferences for things like this, right? The
Mhm.
preferences for, you know, um, complete no exceptions restrictions for laws that place pregnant women in under legal culpability for things like miscarriages, right? That do things like this that essentially establish. Frankly, I don't even know how, and this is I think the argument, right, that the hospitals are making. I don't even know really how you enforce this other than just to stop fertilizing and freezing embryos.
I mean, that's it. That's the first. That's going to be the first step in at least in Alabama, right? Is that they are stopping the process right now. I'm assuming at some point or another, right? They're going to start moving, right? What embryos that are stored in Alabama, right? They're going to be referring patients to treatment into other states nearby, hopefully, right? But adding to that expense of all of these things, right? There's no
Right.
clarity in any of this.
Like you said, with it being so expensive, right? I have friends who've just gone through IVF, right?
I had to too.
Yeah, and they actually live in Nashville, which is very close
Mhm.
to Alabama. But the point being that um like we just said, it's already like a really resource intensive thing to do. So
Mhm.
now like neighboring probably neighboring hospitals in places like Atlanta and Nashville are going to carry an increased pressure on their resources, right, to do this for people.
And honestly, most of these fertility clinics that are doing IVF treatments, they are already at capacity,
Yeah.
right? Because these embryos can be stored for such a period of time, right? You have a lot of women, a lot of couples that have taken this option. I have friends that are in the military, right? That they have gone ahead and done this. Should something happen, right, to the husbands. I've had friends that have health issues and health concerns, right, that are outside of right the day to day that have embryos stored. You're also talking about situations, right? In some cases, dealing with divorced couples, right? If these couples had gone through, or married couples that are now being divorced, that have gone through IVF and have embryos stored, right? There's responsibilities of that. What does this judgment do to them? Right? There's so many implications to all of this. It's absolutely fascinating. It's terrifying, right? Of course, as a woman. You mentioned Dobbs again in the decision. It's ironic to me because the case in and of itself, like I mentioned Roe earlier, Roe, the court specifically said, right, that we're not going to invest in this idea of fetal personhood and personhood protections under the 14th Amendment like we would, right? Intrauterine, right, within this. And then, of course, right, Alito and Dobbs, right, talking about this, they kick it. They kick it to the curb. Alito specifically, and not kick it to the curb, but he kicks it to the states. Right, he said that this isn't the question that we're answering here today. But he does say, right, in his opinion, that the decision and the basis for right Roe so many years ago was complete fallacy. Um, so, right, you can't sit there and say that you're not going to answer this question that was answered by the court and was answered in a genuine way to stem the tide of these very issues that we're talking about. Instead, you say that the whole case and the whole basis, right, for that belief is completely and utterly false. Um, so,
Right. And I think there's a lot of people who have forgotten
yeah.
that there were, you know, there was, I remember growing up, right? kind of freak
Mhm.
out about things like stem cells and various things to do with embryos. Um, and that kind of died out. I don't, it got subsumed pretty quickly back into the more general pro-life
Tricycle.
movement. And
Hmm.
just as science developed, a lot of people kind of, I heard fewer of those objections. That conversation was like a kind of blip that I feel like happened around the turn from the 90s to the 2000s, and there was a lot of talk about it, and then it kind of went away. And I think that maybe there were people who just thought, okay, well, we're still arguing about abortion, but it sure seems like now that science has kind of proven that things like in vitro fertilization can be very helpful for a lot of families, and things like stem cell research can actually cure a lot of, or potentially help with a lot of medical conditions, that everybody had kind of gotten on board, or
Hmm.
at least that the broad consensus had kind of said, okay, like this stuff is not really going to be um, in as much risk of being, sort of affected.
Hmm.
But actually, there's still a really prominent fringe that wants to do all of this. And in certain states, they're not the fringe. They're sitting on courts and they're sitting in legislatures. And this is again that, like, they say, oh, we're going to kick it to the states. Well, some states are actually dominated by this stuff. And
Well,
they're
I
more
mean,
than happy to do it.
yeah, in Alabama's case, I mean, this fetal personhood law actually came as a part of all of the anti-abortion laws, right? And these were ballot initiatives, right?
Mhm.
That, people as a whole in Alabama supported, right? And the state bans abortion at any point in pregnancy, right? There's no exceptions for rape, there's no exceptions for incest, right? There's nothing. I feel like yes, I think a lot of the times we do rely very heavily on this idea that it is a fringe portion of governing bodies that are doing this, but these positions have been pretty well supported throughout the state. And in many states, right? It was what, 12 different states that had trigger laws that went into place less than hours after the Dobbs decisions dropped. We've had 24 different states that have changed their restrictions. Granted, four of those states have provided further constitutional protection, right, to to the towards abortion, towards reproductive rights. Um, but those weights, right, aren't the same.
Well, and this is
Candidates are out there talking about this now, right? Nikki Haley has already endorsed this decision, despite the fact that she was a she was somebody who benefited from the use of fertility treatments.
Well, this is the real
Um,
danger, right? Is because, like, we're in a situation where, just relevant for an election year, right? Where the extreme fringe is going to keep moving. That's what
mhm.
moves the party needle, especially on the Republican side. And so
Yeah.
now Nikki Haley, regardless of whether she actually thinks this is a good decision, the
Yeah.
pressure is for her to say, it's a good decision, right? And that moves the party there by people when people echo it, right? Because
Mhm.
there's probably plenty of Republicans who don't it, either don't agree or simply do not put much thought, that do care about abortions but actually don't think a lot about things like embryo uh, freezing embryos, and,
Mhm.
and the signaling though that's going to happen around this is just going to push the party to more extreme positions. And obviously, um, someone like Donald Trump, he doesn't really care. I think ultimately, right? He'll pick conservative judges, and but he's not personally invested in whether this,
What was
he's
it,
proven time and
earlier
time
this
again right
week?
on abortion. He'll say whatever, right? If he thinks
Right.
it's
I was going to say, but earlier this week didn't wasn't there the leak about what was it, a 15-week ban or 15 or 16-week ban that
right.
was leaked about him saying to his supporters? Right. So, it's still being talked about.
And I think what people need to understand when we talk about this is relevant. I think when people need to understand when we talk about a national ban, we're
Hmm.
talking about where the threshold is set. Because a national ban, none of the ways that Republicans have talked about a national ban would prevent states from going stricter. It would only prevent states from going more liberal. In other words, there could still be plenty of states that say, actually, we're going to be more strict than the national ban, and we're not going to do it at all. So that's the other thing
Hmm.
is, there's a slippage here where it gets covered in the press as if the national ban would be a compromise and everyone would agree. But actually, like the way you hear it talked in Republican circles is the national ban is really just about bringing down the threshold, bringing down the restrictions on the states where there are fewer restrictions, and then still in capping it, and then still allowing the states that want to take things further to do that.
Mhm. I mean, we've progressively seen that with even the Supreme Court's own doctrine, right? We started, of course, with Roe, with the initial trimester, regulations on everything. Then you get Planned Parenthood v. Casey. Then you get all the subsequent cases, right, regarding Planned Parenthood v. Casey. But Casey establishes, right, the undue burden standard. Placing the woman in the center of that, right? That as long as it doesn't create an undue burden upon the mother, then it's fine. Right. And of course, many, many different types of challenges there. Then we see, it expanding at least, right, prior to Dobbs with, Holmes, Healthy Hellerstedt, right, and all of those cases, right, not only now concerned with the burden on the mother, but also the burden on practitioners, right, and providing care to the mother. And then, of course, this whole, total back sweep. So it's always been, right, that slow tightening of the noose.
Right.
Some of
And
those things that are much more practical, right, and make sense, right, as far as if abortion care is something that or care prior to an abortion is a thing, right? Ultrasounds, yes, it's a burden upon the mother, but it's a reasonable burden. Requiring consent, right, an unreasonable burden from the spouse, right? Some of these things are things, but waiting periods and travel times and all of these different kind of things. It's been gearing up for this, and the conservative side has been doing this for a while. They've gotten really good at this, and these are laws and these are things that are just going to get carried from state to state. And you're going to see pretty total adoption, just like you saw right after, right, Dobbs, happening, right? 12 different states within 24 hours, right? Changing those laws, 24 states in the space of, 2 years, changing those laws. It's going to happen quickly,
and
and
a
and
lot of,
there's
I think,
nothing's going to stop.
a lot of even center right oriented people are actually
Mm-hmm.
not as okay with some of these trigger laws, the strictness of them.
Mm-hmm.
But it was easy to sell them. I remember listening to our
Yeah.
our former governor Asa Hutchinson talking about the Arkansas trigger law and
Yes.
admitting in an interview that he thought it actually was too strict, but saying, well, when we passed that, it was a messaging bill. Now,
Mm-hmm.
all I can think was, you don't pass messaging bills into law. Laws are laws. They're not messages. But I think in the time there was an expectation that Roe wasn't going to come down. There is the dog catching the bus is used by everyone, but that is what happened.
Oh, absolutely.
It was easy to sell these bills
Mm-hmm.
and these referendums and these measures
Mm-hmm.
when Roe was the status quo,
Mm-hmm.
because then it was just sort of a way for a lot of voters. It was just a way to signal j- distaste for, opposition to, or discomfort with abortion policy.
Mm-hmm.
And then when Roe goes away, you have these policies in place that are actually quite difficult to roll back. And
Mm-hmm.
granted, we've seen the way it's actually been successful in most states have been
Ballot
places where voters
initiatives.
can actually put a measure on the ballot and take the power back themselves, because the legislatures and the courts are not going to do it for them. They're going to have to do it
Mm-hmm.
themselves. And that's what happened, right, in Ohio and Kansas. And it's what's going to potentially happen in Arkansas, right? There's a measure right now to put limited abortion access back on the books in Arkansas, but that's again a ballot measure. It's and that actually that takes a lot of work.
Yeah.
In a lot
Yeah.
of these
You
states, right, there's a lot of people trying very hard to make sure that those signatures are disqualified and that the hurdles to jump are
have.
high.
But I mean,
Um,
it's even beyond that too. I mean, you're looking at, you're talking about ballot initiatives. Then we see it happening in institutions too, right? State Supreme Courts, right? Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, right? Those campaign seasons and the midterms being such a big deal,
mhm,
because, right, individuals that are on the ballot are individuals that are outspoken, are known, right, protectors, of, right, these reproductive rights. To the point that individuals are getting elected and then potentially getting impeached right before they've even taken the bench, right, like in Wisconsin, or at least the threats and motions being made to that. So it's a terrible thing. Like you said, this isn't a very exciting topic to talk
no.
about. It's not a, a heartwarming, fuzzy anything that's happening, but it's fascinating. Just
And
all of these different pieces and parts.
this is where I want to get back to this issue of uh, putting it back to the states. And
Mhm.
I some from more from and I say this not actually entirely people that I find objectionable, right? From more conservative, even friends are. Hold on just a moment as my dog needs to be let out of the office.
You're good. It gives me a second to take a sip.
Okay. Even more I think as you have uh this chatter about where Rose fallen, etc. You'll hear from conservative people who consider essentially allies and allies in the fight for democracy say, well, in Europe, plenty of European countries, France, etc., there's like a 15 weeks is standard.
Mhm.
And my response would be, if abortion access in the United States was open through 15 weeks, that would be a step back, but it would not that if that were actually the compromise position, it would be a compromise that would protect
Agreed.
rights. The problem is it's not the compromise position because many of the states that want to restrict abortion access are not even willing to go beyond 6 weeks. Some aren't even willing to have any at all as an option. And an abortion ban at the federal level that caps it at 15 weeks. I've not heard one argument yet that would force the states that don't want to go up to 15 weeks to do so. It would only force the states down. And the Dobbs decision is such a great example of this thing we're really concerned about at Pulaski of um, this distinct this kind of this difference in the quality of democracy depending on where you live, right? If you live in a state, particularly it's a relatively big state, rural state, uh, you know, with very limited abortion access, Texas. Um, and just because there is abortion provided, uh, 2, 3 states over, does not actually mean you have in practicality access to those rights, right? You can't really exercise those rights, uh, right? And you can't really take advantage of those services, and you do live under a completely different set of reproductive freedoms. And there's no way to argue that. And this idea of kicking things back to the state obscures the reality that what we're saying is something that for the last, you know, uh, 50 or 70 years, we have said the opposite on, which is that it's actually okay for Americans to live under essentially different uh, levels of access to their rights depending on the state they live in. Um, for the last half century and more, the jurisprudence has been in the opposite direction of that. That's actually not okay. Uh, and we have an entire
Absolutely.
amendment in the Constitution uh, that is supposed to prohibit that idea, the 14th, right? That's supposed to prohibit the idea anyway that uh,
Equal protection under
substantive
the
differences,
laws.
right, in your rights and privileges are not supposed to happen just because you cross a state line.
Mm-hmm.
And yet we are creating a situation where in some states in this country, the list of rights and liberties you have are so much shorter that they start to look like, uh, on paper, you live in a different country.
I mean, it's a shame. I could talk, like I said, I could talk about this all day because you said Texas, and my like brain just lit up on fire. Because you're talking about traveling from state to state. You're talking about right limitations there, and now we've even created a culture there that it's not even just about you not having the right. It's about somebody actually being able to tattle on you for exercising that right in that way. Right. Of course, they're not state entities. It's not state entities challenging this, right? It's man against man. Look, citizen against citizen, that's doing this, right? Because of course if we involve the entities of government into this, we're creating too much entanglement, at least according to the Supreme Court. But we're letting this happen, right? Because now if a woman or if someone aids an individual in seeking care for of a reproductive nature regarding this, right, they can be civilly sued. um, and again, under these structures and under these laws, you're only incentivizing people to do this, and incentivizing them quite highly to do this. So
Right.
it's painful.
Well,
It's
this was I guess a depressing topic to start these on, but we're gonna do these more often. I hope people want to come back and listen to me and Bailey chat uh about stuff. It won't always be as grim as this
hope not.
Alabama court ruling. Uh, but Bailey, thanks for joining me for the first of these, and I look forward to doing more.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Alan, and thanks for listening to my brain ramble.
No problem. All right. See you guys next time.